Okay, so this next session is starting to try to reflect a little bit on theoretical ideas and approaches in political economy, and it's a broad field, and what I think I want to do in this 40 minutes is to kind of open up some discussion, reflect a little bit on different dimensions of that, and hopefully give you a sense of the breadth of the field and where we as a group are also coming from. So I want to run through some questions of, what is the political economy of education in conflict contexts, why political economy has emerged, and why do people think it's important. I also want to reflect a little on kind of orthodox versus critical political economy, and then kind of narrow down a little bit after having gone broad, to focus a little bit on different ways of looking at the relationship between war, education and peace, and what that means for political economy research and some of these issues. So I'll do my best, but again, it's the beginning of a conversation rather than the end, and I hope that it'll inspire you to go on and look at different literature. So in kind of broad levels, the political economy of education is the study of the relationship between economics, politics, and education. And although this political economy has been around for a long time, it's really after the 2000s that it's been taken up within development fields more seriously. And interest was coming in the kind of policy domain from the European Union, from USA, from World Bank, from a range of agencies, who started to recognize that no matter how beautiful their education programs were, that they often landed in contexts that led to those programs going off in different directions, and basically a realization that policies and programs don't just fail because they're not well designed, they often fail because of factors beyond the particular program. And what's called by the kind of orthodox political economists, they talk about externalities, things outside of the frame that they're looking at that affect education policies. And traditionally education has been accused of being quite narrow, quite focused on education issues and not engaging in those relational issues. And the interest in this has been particularly strong in conflict contexts, where there is an argument that both lots of projects, international development projects, have failed, and trying to understand the reasons why. And what we have in political economy is a very broad set of approaches that follow both disciplinary but also ideological lines, and in a sense from the kind of orthodox, classical, neoclassical economic thinking, new institutionalism emerged out of that to try to reflect a little on the reason why, for example, structural adjustment reforms, neoliberal reforms weren't functioning. So it's a quite narrow understanding of the political. They look a lot at externalities. And then on the other extreme, there are much broader political economy analysis, such as cultural political economy, critical cultural political economy, which spans a much broader disciplinary focus, much more interdisciplinary, engages with a range of fields. And in a sense, I want to kind of take you a bit on that journey of the different approaches. But broadly, political economy sees educational policies and interventions as underpinned by political and economic interests, and that we can understand those by doing analysis. And for that reason, and because of what I talked about in the previous slide about the failures of projects, political economy is seen as perhaps a useful tool for policy program support. But for us, it can also be a useful tool for policy critique. It's kind of a possibility to step back from the kind of micro practices of education systems and start to really get into understanding them more relationally. Now, Roger Dale, a sociologist, education sociologist, he used to talk about the difference between education politics and the politics of education. And I think that is a useful framing to kind of understand what is distinct about our work versus broader work in the field of education in emergencies and education in conflict. And what he argued was that a lot of educational research can be located within a notion of education politics, i.e. it concerned itself with debates that were internal to the education system. And he contrasted that with his politics of education, which sought to understand education problems and systems as embedded within a complex local, national and global political economy. So when we're thinking about, for example, shifts in pedagogy towards child-centered pedagogy, for example, that we would try to understand that in relation to transnational global political economy changes, the needs of the workforce, and the way that those things interfere or influence educational decisions in the classroom, that we wouldn't bracket those things off. But as I said, political economy is a very broad school. And back in 2013, a group of us were commissioned to do a review of the literature on the political economy of education in conflict-affected contexts. And we saw that richness and we saw that diversity of thinking. And we thought it helpful at the time to kind of separate out kind of orthodox political economy approaches to education more generally and in conflict contexts, and critical political economy. And we drew up this table as a kind of synthesis of some of the findings that we had when we cut the literature like that. And I just want to talk about this a little because I think that it helps us to understand the way that research approaches influence the way that we carry out research, and then as a consequence of that affects the findings and the things that we discover, which is probably obvious but often undisclosed. So orthodox political economy, and if you want names and advocates, you'll find orthodox political economy championed by many of the major authors for the World Bank. Harry Patrinos in education would be a good example of this. And orthodox political economy approaches, they often draw on neo-institutional economics, which I mentioned already. Their framework is often to see the West as a kind of ideal type. That the hierarchy of the world is seen as a kind of pyramid with the West on the top, and the hope that other systems can eventually adapt themselves to a kind of Western model. So it's often about best practice being spread from the north to the south rather than vice versa. They also often see education and development problems as endogenous. I talked about this in the earlier talk, that the problems of Sierra Leone are often framed as if they all exist within the frontiers, within the borders of Sierra Leone, and they're not affected by actors outside. For example, in the case of Sierra Leone, mining companies, transnational corporations, the history of colonialism that has affected those that national development. So these approaches, orthodox approaches, would bracket those things off and start inside the country. They often see donors and international community as neutral, as helpers. They often treat local culture as something to fade away as development, modernization occurs. And they often see any resistance to policy implementation as a kind of form of deviance. Now, what I mean by that is there's lots of work that Patronos and others have done, seeing or constructing, for example, teachers' unions as the major obstacle to their reforms. And they also always see teachers' unions as kind of pathological, that they are resisting reforms because they have some vested interest, but not for the good of the country. So it's always seen as negative. So resistance is constructed as negative. They often have a very economic-centric focus with little reflections on inequality and social justice, big focus on growth, efficiency, and, the broader economics of education lead. But, on the plus side, lots of their theory is very good at problem-solving kind of ideas and policy solutions, which becomes a critique for critical political economy. So if we look now at critical political economy, its roots are quite distinct, drawing on Marx's classic critique of political economy, moving on to a range of other theories, dependency theory, world systems theory, post-colonialism, feminist theory, a whole range of critical theories underpin a lot of the analysis. Unlike the Orthodox, they often see the North as the problem and the local, national as a solution. They see education problems as exogenous. It's about the donors, it's about the agencies, it's about external actors interfering within countries. They see donors, international communities having vested interest. They have been critiqued for a lack of focus on broader issues of culture and others, and you can see a shift in the research to open up to address different dimensions beyond the economic within critical political economy. Again, they often see resistance as legitimate rather than illegitimate in an unequal system, that it makes sense that teachers' unions, it makes sense that communities organise against reforms rather than the opposite. And they have a central focus on inequality, social exclusion, social justice. But a strong critique often of critical political economy research is that it's good at critique, but often less able to offer policy solutions. And I think that's really a challenge. Now, just thinking more broadly about the two kind of categories, for me, it reminds me very much of the tensions between classic development thinking as well, in terms of the difference between modernization theory and dependency theory, which comes from this critical political economy. And for the Orthodox, essentially, the world is okay. It might need some tinkering around the edges, but essentially, the system is functioning, and anyone that resists it is constructed as deviant. And within the modernization theory, it was this kind of idea that the society is organic. And if you have a deviance, you need to kind of remove that from the body. So often that manifests itself in policies to weaken trade unions, etc., and not understand the rationales of that. For the critical political economy camp, the understanding of the world is much more critical, that it's rooted in a highly unequal system that is producing resistance, and resistance is rational. So there is kind of broad dimensions and critiques that I think we can understand. And these are important because they underpin then the way that people address research topics. My own journey in critical political economy, in a sense, crosses both geography, but also dimensions of thematic areas. And, of course, like many, I've been influenced by classic political economy, from Marx, Gramsci, Rosa Luxemburg, others. But for many years, I've been interested in thinkers coming from the global south and the way that they have constructed these issues of political economy, in a sense, as a critique of northern Marxism. And you can see in the image here Walter Rodney and his classic work on how Europe underdeveloped Africa, Kwame Nkrumah and his critiques of dependency and Western imperialism, Arturo Escobar, Colombian scholar who has done great work on trying to understand the links between development and colonialism, and the links between development and underdevelopment. Orlando Fels-Borda, Steve Biko, and his Black consciousness. All of these, I think, give a very important perspective on political economy, coming from a Southern perspective. And another important dimension, of course, for us is the political economy of education, and scattered across the images there, you'll see a range of education thinkers, from Paulo Freire, Michael Apple, Salim Bali, Yusuf Said from South Africa, Leon Tickley, Susan Robertson, Roger Dale, Fazil Rizvi, a whole range of rich analysis that, broader than political economy of education and conflict, have really gone into the broader issues of the political economy of education and the changes that have gone on over years. I think importantly, and I touched on this in the previous slide, is that critical political economy has also undergone its own critique or absorption of critique of others, particularly a greater focus on issues around race and the importance of understanding race, issues around colonialism and the importance of understanding colonialism, not only as a kind of form of imperialism, but also issues around coloniality, decolonization. Those debates have been really important. Issues around knowledge and what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls epistemicide. That he makes the case that there can be no social justice without cognitive social justice. The ideas matter, and we need to engage with Southern ideas, and he argues for the need for more diversity in thinking. And I think that's been adopted in the political economy frameworks. Issues around gender, very important. Critique of Orthodox classic critical political economy, that it needs to open up to issues more of relationships of gender. So in a sense, there are a range of cuts that one could think about in terms of critical political economy, and they relate to disciplinary issues, but also historical evolution of thinking, the absorption of critique, the cultural and critical turn in social theory that shape framings. But I think it's important for us to ground some of the thinking that we have in this field of the political economy of education in conflict effects on both conflict and then education, and to try to understand how those framings of thinking about why people go to war influence the way that we understand education issues, problems, solutions, and effects. And there are a range of bodies of thought in conflict, political economy of conflict. But for me, they kind of boil down to three broad areas. You have those writers that kind of understand the emergence of conflict in relation to cultural issues. There are others that have more structural takes, which understand conflict emerging out of inequalities, structural inequalities. And then you have a third one, which is the kind of, which has become dominant really since the late 1990s, advocated by Paul Collier and others of the World Bank, which is a kind of neoclassical understanding of why wars break out, which is much more to do with individual greed. Armed actors seek to increase their wealth through armed struggle, and that it can be understood in that way. Now, I want to take you through this precisely because I want to reflect on the policy implications that emerge out of different analyses. The classic kind of cultural take that has emerged is this kind of idea that conflicts emerge as a kind of form of new barbarism, that they are fueled by ancient hatreds, clashes of civilizations. And one thinks about this clash of civilization developed by Huntington as the kind of precursor to really what we've lived through in the last 20 years with the kind of binary construction of Islam versus Christianity, the war on terror, and a lot of those arguments around difference that have led to justifications of the prolongation of this kind of framing. And Huntington's analysis that emerged after the end of the Cold War argued that while previous conflicts engaged princes, nation states, and ideologies, today's conflicts are located around civilizations. He suggests that cultural differences have become the key driver of global insecurity, both within and between states, while the key conflict is between Islam and Christianity, which for him was about democracy versus barbarism. And I think we can see the way that that carries on in the images of Afghanistan portrayed in the press over recent months. Now, the important thing here for us is then we think about, well, if you understand conflicts emerging out of that way, then what would be the policies that would emerge from that? And, you know, often it's emerging around kind of winning the cultural debate, democracy, enlightenment, the production of the benevolence of the Western culture, and the need to impose democracy and liberal capitalism, as we saw through subsequent invasions and occupations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places. A structural take really is the classical way that we've often understood conflicts, that groups go to war to address injustices, whether they be socioeconomic, cultural, political. But I think that argument was developed particularly in this era, say post-2000 globalization era, where we increasingly became more entangled through the effects of a more integrated global economy and polity, the rise of transnational corporations and the increasing interrelationship between nation states and the increasing predominance of transnational actors, that there was given a really global understanding. And Mark Duffield, well-known political economist, talked about the way that increased violence is a product of a highly exclusionary and contemporary informational economy and polity where large geographic parts of the world are marginalized. He suggests that the neoliberal global economy and its related governance mechanisms lock many groups out of the benefits of globalization and increase the likelihood of entry into illicit activities such as crime and violence. So his take, in a sense, is this kind of a global take, but a recognition that inequalities in their different manifestations really underpin the reason why we have so much violence and conflict in the world. And of course, if you take that position, then your solutions, your policy solutions, are going to rotate around trying to redress those inequalities, thinking about north-south relationships, internal relationships within countries around inequality, and starting to try to understand the manifestation of, for example, religious exclusion, cultural exclusion, issues of poverty, etc. So you can kind of see where research framings would then lead you in terms of reflecting on that. And, you know, at the back of our mind, we're always thinking about, you know, how does this manifest itself in education systems? And then the third approach, economic rational choice, which really emerged from the World Bank and became very predominant, was a challenge or a critique of the classic grievance argument that people go to war because of inequalities, because of injustices. And Collier and others argued that conflicts were driven primarily by economic greed on the part of warring factions. It draws on a kind of rational choice, very individualistic framework, which suggested that wars are driven less by grievances and far more by personal or collective greed. And in this approach, humans are often viewed as engaged in conflict as kind of economic agents seeking out profit. And they often use as examples Sierra Leone, Liberia conflict, and blood diamonds, and this argument that essentially the armed actors that rose up in Sierra Leone, for example, were driven by the profit motive rather than senses of injustice, exclusion, marginalization. And of course, if you take that perspective, then the route to peace and security would not be through addressing inequality and structural exclusion as the previous one would have been, but really through focusing on cutting off access to resources of violent actors, trying to find ways of closing them down, removing their weapons, removing their sources of income. And we saw that manifest itself in the construction of Sierra Leone youth as bandits, drug addicts, and not exploring the historical marginalization of Sierra Leonean communities and why they might enter into armed groups. Similar influence, very strong influence it had on the conflict in Latin America, in Colombia, where this kind of thinking led to the pursuit not of addressing the structural inequalities that exist in Colombia, one of the most unequal countries in the world, but a military solution with massive financial aid to the Colombian military to try to destroy the armed opposition. So policies emergent from those analyses reflect the way that they're understanding. So I guess the question for us is, where does education fit into this process? No? How do we understand education's entry into this? And I think there are a number of ways that as you develop your research, you can think about education. And I want to kind of look at it in different ways, in a sense, kind of cuts that have been done by different people over the years, which might start the blood flowing and start us thinking about that. Now, we've already talked a little bit about the kind of classic understanding, which sees education as being a victim, So we look at the use of force, of targeting civilians, civilian institutions and schools. We explore issues around children, teachers, schools on the front line, how they've been dispersed. The occupation of schools, there's been research on those areas, and also the way that because of conflict, often what happens is that the government diverts, and the international community for that matter, diverts resources towards the war effort and away from social sectors. So even if education systems are not directly targeted by war and conflict, indirectly they lose their funding. You know, in a sense, there's lots of research that could be done thinking about the way that armed conflict, violent conflict has affected school systems. But as we said, education can also be a contributor to that, and we can think about the way unequal provision reproduces social disparities and resentment, and you know, the political economy process of that. One can think here of South Africa and the different amounts of resources that went towards education under apartheid to different ethnic political communities. How much money was spent on black, coloureds, whites in South Africa during apartheid reflects that unequal provision which fueled. But we could also think of issues around language, religion, ethnicity, and the way that schooling could exacerbate those issues. The imposition of languages and the imposition of certain religious norms in schools and the exclusion of other religions, which can make schools a really alienating and violent place. And of course, schools can also trigger conflict because they fail to deliver the aspirations that they purport to aspire to. So, you know, you have a lot of unemployed youth that go through school systems and then can't find work in the economy. And so questions of the appropriacy of the education, of the link to the labour market, but also equally exclusion from schooling. So lots of issues that can be understood through a political economy lens. And, you know, you get that kind of classic understanding that underpins lots of the thinking, which kind of understands the way that education can do both produce and reproduce conflict, or also push towards more equal rights and opportunities, tolerance, respect for diversity, etc. There are also interesting ways to explore what might be understood as the kind of cycles of violence and the diversity of violence. Thinking of the work of for example, positive and negative peace within conflict studies developed by Galton, where he talked about the need to understand peace not as the cessation purely of armed conflict. His argument being that violence manifests itself in a range of forms, cultural, economic, political, and that we need to redress all of those forms and not just stop the guns. Because if you just stop the guns, you don't get at the roots of the conflict, that the roots of the issues that led to conflict. And in this table here, there is one way of dividing up some of that to think about different ways that different forms of violence manifest themselves in schools. So, you know, on number one there, you have the direct violence, you know, which is, you know, the occupation of schools, attacks on teachers, those kind of things. But then you have indirect violence, which is the exclusion, for example, of certain minority groups from education, the imposition of alien languages, marginalization of certain communities versus others. All of these are forms of indirect violence that can have massive effects. And then he goes on to talk about repressive violence, alienating violence. But I think that important in this is the framing to understand that the visible manifestation is a bit like this iceberg kind of understanding, that on the surface, at the top, you can see physical violence, but underneath it, you can see the drivers of that physical violence manifesting themselves in a range of different ways. And unless you start to get underneath and understand those inequalities, the alienation, the different types of exclusions that are going on, then you can't really resolve those issues at the top. And, you get the situation that you redress temporarily the visible direct violence, but it will bubble up again because the root causes of that violence have not been addressed. Another way of thinking about the political economy of education in conflict context is also through temporality, through time. And, this has been done by a range of authors. And in that temporality, they talk about the kind of pre-conflict period, in the midst of conflict, immediate post-conflict, long-term post-conflict period, and different ways of trying to understand how the education system relates to that. So, for example, the kind of education prevention, which would be understood during in periods where there are obviously tensions, but conflict has not broken out, education in emergencies in the midst of conflict, and then education for social and civic reconstruction, the kind of education for peace building, I guess, that people have often written about. So a range of different lenses, I think, to think about the education conflict relationship. And then our own approach has been to try to explore this justice, injustice, equality, inequalities within education, and how to explore those, address those, and understand their relationship to trying to build reconciliation in post-conflict environments. So a range of different approaches. And tomorrow and the next day, we will explore a little bit more in terms of the tools and the ways that you might approach this political economy research in different ways. But I think basically my point there is that you can explore these issues in a range of different ways through a range of different lenses. There is work that's already been done, and I just wanted to show the index, and I'm going to share the PowerPoint, and these are all linked to open access online resources. But this was a special issue of the Education and Conflict Review, which is a journal based at the Institute of Education, which tried to pull together some of the theory and conceptual frameworks in the field of education, conflict, and peace building. And so in that, you can see a range of different ways, including our 4 Rs, but a range of other approaches to theory and concept frameworks in this field. And this journal is hopefully where successful fellows will publish a special issue, hopefully in a year and a half, when we finished all of this research, and we will have our own access, and then I can be using your work to teach other researchers in the future. So just to kind of conclude, hopefully I haven't gone over my time too much, is that political economy of education can take a range of different forms. but important to know that it's underpinned by a range of diverse theoretical standpoints. A doctoral student of mine was reflecting on his 4-year journey, and I asked him, what was the one thing that he learned during his studies? And he said that he really enjoyed the fact that he could walk into a room, listen to people talking, and then immediately locate them theoretically. He could understand where they're coming from. And I think that part of this political economy work is to start to understand that when we see a policy on the ground, we start to ask, where did that come from? What are the logics that underpin that? What are the drivers of these particular interventions? And not just take that intervention as a kind of technical process, but try to understand and ask those questions, because they do inform policy ideas and policy plans. And, in a sense, recognize that ideas don't fall from the sky, but they're linked to different material interests, political projects, geopolitical intentions. And I guess, there's a kind of, it's a realization more than anything that the starting point for any work in political economy has to be a rich and deep understanding of context, of history, to ground that work. There isn't any kind of magic bullet or magic tool or framework that can assist in doing good research without that real hard individual work to ground the research in that particular context, because it's there you can understand the power dynamics, the relationships, the issues.